So, as a super fan of the Beatles and John Lennon in particular, I thought, why haven't I done an episode about the assassination of John Lennon and the person who assassinated John Lennon? I mean, why haven't we done a deep dive on his psychology?
Right.
And when I suggested it, Berto, to you, I dedicated a couple days to researching it, and I thought it would be a medium deep dive. As I got into it, I found it way more complicated than I thought, and much more data was available to us, and contradictory things about the psychology of the individual who assassinated John Lennon. And so we were supposed to record this the last time we got together, but I texted you that day, and I was like, I'm halfway through my notes. There's no way I'm going to get this done. And so it gave me another couple weeks to work on this.
The test was postponed.
Yeah. And what I found was that it's kind of a mysterious case. It's, as a lot of these cases are that we'll get into, but I thought there would be some simple narrative as to why the individual who assassinated John Lennon did what he did. I thought there would be some kind of, he was psychotic and he was having a delusional episode or something along those lines, but there really wasn't a simple answer. And people want a simple answer. And I found a lot of interesting answers, he's crazy, psychotic, he's obsessed with John Lennon, he's narcissistic, he wanted to be famous, the book Catcher in the Rye made him do it. And by the way, all these are factors that are possible that we'll get into later. Others are Nixon hated John because John was considered to be one of the leaders of the extremists in the 70s. One of the things that's sort of lost to history is just how much domestic terrorism there was in the 70s by the left. There were terrorists in the United States who were sending bombs to politicians' houses, to professors, to individuals, and killing them or maiming them. And there were kidnappings, Hearst, what's her face? Patty Hearst. And John Lennon was definitely considered to be one of the heroes of that side of things. There are many heroes, but John Lennon being one of them. And Nixon was notorious for, keeping America great again and raising those walls, and xenophobic and conservative, and reportedly really wanted to get rid of John Lennon and worked with Elvis, actually. This is all documented too, because Elvis felt threatened by the Beatles. You've heard of that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know about the exact nature of Elvis's involvement, but Nixon definitely wanted to get him deported. And so they thought, well, maybe Nixon got the CIA or the FBI, and they did a Manchurian Candidate where they programmed this individual to be brainwashed and like a robot. And because that was the belief, and still is to some extent, that the government could brainwash people in this way and cause them to kill people, like in the Manchurian Candidate. Other theories are Stephen King killed him. Have you heard of that theory?
No.
Yeah, there's a whole...
Stephen King?
Yeah, I don't understand.
Wow.
Other people think John killed himself, actually. Other people think John died in 1965 and John was an imposter. I knew the Paul is dead thing, but I never
heard of the John was dead.
Right, but on the album cover of Help, they have these nautical or Navy hand signals, and it doesn't spell help. You would think that it would spell help.
Oh, what? I thought it did.
No, it spells NUJV, which means nothing other than, possibly, according to conspiracy theorists, new unknown John vocalist.
Oh, okay. Well, A, that's dumb. B, no, I bet you they were trying to spell help, and either that's in the British Royal Navy, or someone made a massive mistake, or it's a mirror image, or who knows. But like,
yeah. But there were people back then that believed not only Paul was dead, but John was dead.
Yeah.
And other people think John faked his own death, etc.
Right.
So today's episode, I want to go into Mark Chapman is the individual who assassinated John Lennon, and I'm going to refrain from using his name for reasons that we'll get into as much as I can.
Who?
And we'll be talking about John Lennon and about the impact and what my take is. Of course, I can't diagnose from afar, but I can make some speculative comments based on evaluations and findings that have been made by other professionals throughout the years. And we'll talk about whether or not we think that he should be put on parole in 2022, because he has his 12th parole hearing later this year. So let's get into it. What do you say, Berto?
Let's do it.
This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor. Who are you, Berto?
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I embroider little gnomes onto t-shirts.
Let's get into the assassination itself, just in case you didn't know. John Lennon, formerly of the Beatles. The Beatles broke up 1969, and this is 1980, so 11 years later. On December 8th, he was murdered right in front of his home in New York City. He lived in the famous Dakota building, which was home to a lot of famous people over the years, and maybe most famously is the building that's in Rosemary's Baby.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That is a creepy building, actually. Maybe it's just because of the association.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're in there, it's this really
It's
cool.
probably fine.
Yeah, and it's built in the late 1800s, and anyway. And it's right across the street from Central Park. You know, it's just
But see,
perfect.
like, all those buildings, I do have that 70s horror association with, old New York buildings.
It's almost like the things you watch influence the way you feel about them.
It might be.
So this was Lita's birthday, by the way. In the beginning of the podcast, it was me, Berto, and Lita, and
Right.
I grew up with Lita, and we would always talk about on our birthday that it was the day John Lennon died. It was a frequent kind of coinciding day that we would discuss. But so he was shot as he was entering the building by the person I mentioned earlier. 5 shots, but 4 of them hit at close range in his back. He was coming home from the recording studio with Yoko, and he pretty much instantly died. And, I'm just imagining getting shot in the back 4 times. And huge impact on the culture. What impact do you think? I mean, Berto, you were 3 or 4 years old at the time, but what is your
5.
understanding of the impact of not only John Lennon, but his death and everything, the way people saw it in 1980, 1981? How do you think people reacted?
It was sort of like the end of an era, and also the death of possibilities in a way, because John Lennon stood for a lot of things. He stood for a new kind of music. He stood for a new kind of thinking. And, people, most of us, what we knew about him was very positive on the whole. And he seemed to be for peace, and he seemed to be for revolution, but of thought and of words. And so it felt like a big setback.
Yeah, and
culturally.
as a caveat to this, and I think you're alluding to it, we did a whole deep dive on John Lennon and found that there are multiple reports of him being pretty viciously abusive to the 3 women romantically that he was involved with Yoko Ono, with Cynthia and his first wife, and with, I forget her last name, and with Cynthia Lennon, I guess, and with the woman he was with briefly in Los Angeles. I think her name was, I can't remember her name, but multiple reports of him being pretty abusive, pretty reactive, pretty angry, pretty jealous and possessive. And yet his public persona was one of peace and of justice, social justice. And so, we should just take that into consideration. But yeah, the impact on the culture, I agree with a lot with what you're saying, or completely with what you're saying. And the things that he symbolized, and I don't think people realized what he symbolized entirely until he died, right? I think he symbolized a big part of the 60s. This is the beginning of the 80s, and I'm, I was 9 at the time when he died, or actually I guess I just turned 10 early December. It was actually just a few days after my birthday, and I remember it I think, in that, and I was asking my mom about this, if she remembered it as well, and she says it's possible, but she doesn't remember specifically, that we were running errands the day of that, the next day that it was being announced, and they were playing wall to wall John Lennon on every radio station that we were listening to. And back in those days in Seattle, it was KJR on AM. And in my memory, that's what I remember. And I had a pretty limited understanding of the Beatles, and I certainly had heard a lot of Beatles songs by that point. But anyway, the sense that I had growing up, though, throughout the 80s, was that his death kind of symbolized a death of the 60s and a introduction into the 80s, which was really quite different. You can't really get much different than the 60s and the 80s. I mean, the 80s were almost like a pendulum swing away from the 60s, and the big joke was that all these hippies who were screaming and protesting about equality and anti-capitalism were suddenly all working for corporations, and they were 35. They weren't 15 anymore. They were 35 and in the 80s, and had become the man, and greed is good and all those kinds of things. And so John Lennon dying symbolized that. Another thing was just like his lyrics were so honest and again standing for peace, and he really was a true activist, and really sacrificing his image, sacrificing his monetary gain to advocate for peace and advocate for love and advocate for social justice. So also he symbolized, even though he was super rich, kind of the everyman, kind of the working man. The what's this song, Working Man, Working Hero Man, or whatever?
Working class hero.
Working class hero, yeah.
Yeah, that was a thing about it too. There was this incredible allure that he had FU money, of course. He could have just gone and disappeared, and he didn't owe anyone anything, let's say. So that's the case. But at the same time, you got this sense of like, he's telling it like it is. He can really tell it to the man because he's not beholden to anyone. So in today's day and age, he would run as a politician and do well.
All right. So he was 40 when he got shot, and he had just started recording again after taking 5 years off. The Beatles break up in 1969, 1970. He and all the Beatles really dive into their solo work, and John did pretty well, and it was a lot of him and Yoko Ono. And he had, limited success, especially when compared to Paul and George, and even Ringo to some extent. And he was having, some troubles with family life. He was having some troubles with drugs and alcohol. Listen to our whole deep dive on that. And then he just decided, I'm going to pull away from recording. I'm going to pull away from interviews. I just want to spend time with my son, my second son, Sean. What have you heard about this stage of his life, Berto?
Yeah, I think so. One of the interesting things is, like you said, he died at 40. When I was younger, I always had the impression that, he died as an older man, and but it was that whole time warp of the Beatles where by the 68 time frame, I pictured the Beatles as like 50-year-olds. And so by the time John died, I thought, but in reality, the years leading up to his death, he was in his like mid 30s. And that is that point where you've kind of gone over that 30s bump, which so many of us go through. And he was starting to look around and be like, what really matters, and what do I really care about? And I think reconnecting with being a father and really diving into that became more important to him, which makes sense. A lot of people go through a similar journey.
Yeah. I mean, in today's world, going 5 years without releasing an album isn't really strange.
Right.
But
for them.
Yeah. I mean, they would release 1 or 2 albums a year.
Yeah.
So it was strange for him and maybe other artists at the time. But yeah, some might say that when he took a break at the age of 35, for the first time, he had just stopped the madness and decided to focus on the important things of life. And then he records in early 1980 or maybe 1979-ish, releases in 1980 in November, Double Fantasy, which is, I think, his best album.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It has like just incredible tracks, and which we'll get into later. And just less than a month after the release of this album, he's gunned down, and you just wonder like what we could have had if we could have had him throughout the 80s. I mean, just imagine, like David Bowie had a whole thing in the 80s. He had a revival in the 80s.
Yeah.
You just imagine like John Lennon would have been right there, and what he could have said, what he could have railed against. I mean, there were so many shitty things about Reagan and about the 80s that he could have been there to comment on, and he was just taken away.
Well, he'd still
from
be
this.
around today, I mean, likely, maybe,
Right. Yeah.
Ringo is still around, Paul's still around.
Right.
And yeah, he'd be through all this stuff that's happened to the world. He would have been there as another person that some of us would listen to.
And there could have been a reunion, because that was
There could have been a
big. That was
reunion.
another big reaction at the time,
God.
because there was always talk about a reunion, and the Beatles, the former Beatles, often would say, "Yeah, maybe one day."
Yeah.
But when John died, it just ended that
beyond that.
possibility.
By the way, you were saying how, he took a break and 5 years go by, and today that's not that much. Well, it's even so that when the band ended, Paul also took a break, but I think in his case it was only like 9 months or something, but it was like an eternity.
Right. So for him to have died, the other aspect of it that I think is tragic and poetic in a way is that the reason why the murderer had access to John was because John early on he liked New York City because he felt like he could blend in, even though people might recognize him. So he would say everyone's so busy with their own stuff that they don't bother him, and he could walk the streets. He could go to the coffee shop. He could walk around to the grocery store, and people didn't scream. And there's people in New York have better things to do than to bother some old Beatle. And he loved it in New York, and he loved it for that reason. And that's why he lived in a building that, it's a semi-fancy building. It has a doorman, but he didn't have security. He just wandered around. And this is kind of depicted in that Two of Us, that movie that you haven't seen yet. That's a fictional depiction or a possible depiction of when Paul visited John, soon before he had died, John. And they walk around the corner and they just go to a cafe and people walk up to them and say hey, or whatever. And so he was anti-fame. He was anti-class, right? He's like, I'm one of the people, and I eschew all that crap. I mean, you just can't imagine Paul doing it, or really any of the Beatles.
Bless you. Yeah.
Just living, on the streets and walking around anyway, or living with access to the streets. Anyway, okay, so let's get into Mark Chapman himself. And the reason why I don't want to mention his name that often is because people sometimes do these kinds of crimes because they want people to comment on their name, this individual included. So childhood, born 1955, born in Texas, grew up in Georgia. He had a rough childhood reportedly, but it's hard to know, it's hard, it's like a lot of people have rough childhoods, so how bad was it for him? Well, it's hard to tell, but the data is that he had a bad relationship with his father. His parents fought a lot. His dad was abusive to his mom. How extensive was this? How did the murderer react to it as a kid? Hard to know. So possible neglect, possible trauma from violence. It's hard to know. Other reports was that he was enmeshed with his mom. His mom told him that the only reason she married his father was so that she could have him as a child. She told him that he was destined to be famous. So this is perhaps when this narcissism starts to build. Around this time, mid-60s, Beatlemania was happening, and he idolized John in particular and the Beatles. And he would report that the Beatles were his first real positive connection with the outside world. So he had a real difficult, enough of a difficult, and perhaps a very difficult home life. And the Beatles provided him this escape,
Right.
this window into the outside world, something he could enjoy. And this locked in his very important association with the Beatles in his heart and in his mind, But at the same time, even as a young child, he envied their fame. He worshipped them and envied them. Berto, can you relate to that?
I think I was in high school, late high school, early college, when I was completely obsessed with the Beatles and reading all the biographies and doing all that stuff. Even then, though, I don't remember being obsessed with one particular Beatle. It was more the whole thing. But I know that people do, and people get obsessed about actors, musicians, and so sports stars. And it is interesting that obsession can border on also mixed feelings. Sometimes they might sort of hate the person, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, which is what he gets into. Did you ever envy the Beatles and their fame? Want to be them?
I definitely wanted to be them. I don't know if I ever envied the Beatles. I envied other bands, okay. I remember in the early 90s, I would be kind of annoyed by, how did they get famous? I don't like that music.
Like Nirvana and stuff?
No, Nirvana I really liked. But there were others.
Garbage?
Around that time. Yeah, for example, Garbage.
Okay.
There were a few bands that were very hyped, that I would listen to, and I'm like,
as a musician, you're like, that could have been me. Why isn't
exactly.
Why isn't that me?
Or even if it can't be me, it shouldn't be them. But the Beatles, I was never like that. The Beatles, I was always just admiring of them. And sure, I wanted to be the Beatles, but I never envied them. I never had those thoughts of oh, damn those Beatles.
Yeah. And neither did he at this moment. So in summary, I mean, he does later, but in summary, we can see perhaps that he had a bastion in narcissism as an escape. He probably, later on, he would reveal that he had deep feelings of worthlessness. Who knows if he had it as a child? He probably did because of what he went through. And then his mom comes along and meshes with him, tells him he's special, and he might think of himself as well, I want to be the sort of person my mom wants me to be so that I can maybe finally get the love and attention that I want. I'm speculating pretty severely at this point.
When you're saying meshes, are you using that as a technical term?
Enmesh.
Enmesh, and what does that entail?
It is a family therapy term that involves a relationship with diffuse boundaries or too permeable boundaries. Often, there's different forms, but the one that occurs here is the child knows too much about the emotional life of the parent and feels pressured by the parent emotionally to be like a companion against the father, seemingly. Also, we see at this point, he starts to escape into fantasy. He has these little people that he talked about. And so this gets in, and we'll talk about this throughout.
Odd.
But, so there's a spectrum here of possibility. One is that it's just a metaphor, because all of us are prone, or, for you and I to watch the end of Mandalorian season 2 and see Luke Skywalker show up with his young hair and his R2-D2 and his X-Wing fighter and his green lightsaber, and you and I are crying. I mean, these things are fictional stories. They don't exist, and yet it feels real to us. So, there's that end of the spectrum. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where you literally are psychotic and believe and see or really believe that there are little people. He at a young age he reports that he would start to have conversations or interactions with, or he would observe these little people that lived in the walls, that lived in his house. Yep. And is this pretend, or, is it severe creativity, or is it an actual delusion? What do you think, Berto, for him?
Well, so I watched these documentaries you pointed me to, and so that's all I'm going by. But my feeling from it is either he was fully lying to somehow plead insanity or whatever, or it had to be something more psychotic happening, because the way it was described wasn't just, here's some, because, I've talked about this with my shopping compulsion back in the day, that I would have essentially two voices in my head. And what I mean by that is there was a mental process that would run through my head going, yeah, you should buy this shirt. You owe it to yourself. And then there was another mental process that would be like, but maybe you shouldn't. And that those were kind of competing voices. But at no point was I thinking, whoa, is someone talking to me? That dragon is in my head. Like, there was never anything like that. It was all, So I know that, of course, all of us have different mental processes. But the way it was described was way more literal than that. These were physical beings having conversations.
And we don't have access to him or the interview.
Yeah.
And so I was left with a question mark, though, about what you're saying, because the way he described it, there's a possibility that he's not, shall we say, mainstream creative, but he could just have a super active imagination, particularly when you're a kid. I mean, I had imaginary friends when I was 4 years old. Does that mean I'm psychotic? No. So it's hard to know. And to address the question of him trying to act like he was insane, he actually actively fought against that defense, because he did not want to be seen that way. And he actually wouldn't cooperate with his own lawyers and experts because he did not want to be seen that way. He didn't want to, he didn't even want to really get away with the crime. He's like, no, I mean, I did it. And then he just ended up, against his lawyer's advice, he just pled guilty. He's like, yeah, I did it. And I wasn't insane at the time. So
which is part of why if I was really trying to be like, no, I'm in full control of my faculties, and I was aware that, talking about little people that I talk to is going to be construed as not being fully in control, I would not talk about it. But he talked about it. So it makes me think that it was real, meaning that it felt real to him.
Yeah, and we'll get more into that later. But at the very least, what we would say at this stage of his life, he reports that this is when these little people started to show up.
Right.
And he was adored by these little people. He says, I was very imaginative and I played by myself. So this points to, potential trauma and isolation from other people. With peers, he was reportedly a bully, and he was isolated and withdrawn. So again, we can see here perhaps an effect of his issues at home bleeding into his friend life at school, making him feel like he's different, maybe his defenses from, again, it's a lot of speculation, but his defenses to the trauma made him seem weird to other people or suspicious of other people, and he was alone a lot. So this is more worthlessness and more of a need to escape into fantasy and possibly narcissism. 1967, age 12, he learned that John used drugs. So just remember here, he's 12 years old, living in Georgia. So he learns that John and the Beatles, but particularly John, uses drugs. And so he did too. He did whatever John did at this time. And so he took whatever he could get his hands on: LSD, marijuana, pills, sniff glue, etc. He's what we call, in my subsection of my discipline, a polysubstance user, someone that they don't tend to have a drug of choice. And they tend to be described in that way, that whatever they can get their hands on, they're shoving in their body. It just doesn't matter. They just don't want to be sober. And it's often extremely chaotic and very destructive, which, you could imagine. It's possible he was self-medicating, an already emerging trauma reactivity of depression. Hard to know. But at the time, it's 1967, it's the summer of love. So he enters into the hippie culture, right? And, but really of any time since then, there's always been a druggy clique within every school. And so for the first time, he says he was accepted by these people, but it was conditional. It was around drug use together, right?
Right.
Around this time, he also started writing music and recording, and he...
Yeah, by the way, I had no idea about that whole thing, or I had forgotten.
Yeah, similar to Charlie Manson, which we'll get into later. And he covered Beatles songs. Fast forward to 1970, age 15. He ran away from home, so he's, well into drug culture at this point. Runs away from home to go to Florida to be with hippies, apparently in that part of the world. Florida had the hippies, not California. And did you know that Florida would be a mecca for hippies?
That's surprising to me, because I would have thought it was too conservative or something.
Yeah. He quickly met a couple hippies who got him stoned. He passed out and they stole his wallet. So he became very disillusioned. And by the way, this is a common story. George Harrison, he heard about Haight-Ashbury and that whole hippie culture in San Francisco. And he went to San Francisco and he found that, according to George, everyone was just strung out and dirty and homeless and suffering and, a lot of bad things. And so the glorification of that group is sometimes glorified in a way that wasn't actually true. I'm sure there were pockets of free love and wonderfulness, but it's also a attractor of criminals and people that
it's
are
also young people too,
Yeah, people that are trying to make, they run away from home because they hate their parents. She's leaving home, bye-bye. I don't have any money. What am I going to do?
Right.
So.
Well, it's like, we were talking about Nirvana and stuff. In the grunge movement, I wasn't really part of the scene, but I feel like in the scene, there was this feeling of, this is the new thing, and it's a new world, and it wasn't very political, but there was a commentary under the surface. At the same time, it's just young people kind of like doing new things and having fun, and so it's not as mystical as it might appear on the surface. Like the whole, what was all those grunge terms and all the slang words, and it's all, a lot of that stuff is just on the surface. So I wasn't there in the 60s with the hippie movement, so from the outside looking in, it looks like, oh man, that was the summer of love, and everyone's just so well read about philosophy or whatever. It's like, no, it's a lot of young people getting high and not killing each other directly, so that's good.
Yeah. I mean, I was, speaking of the grunge, movement, so to speak, I was ground zero for that. I was in a band in Seattle from 1989 till, through the 90s, and played the same clubs that Nirvana did and that Soundgarden did. There was a Crocodile. The Ditto actually was it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a pretty important venue, and very non-glamorous.
I mean, you came up with half those grunge terms yourself.
Yeah. So he was disillusioned by the hippies, and he turns to Jesus. He swings the other direction.
Right.
And he goes to church, and he finds another community, and he finds meaning. And again, he feels like, oh, I finally found acceptance. He's searching. Somewhere I will feel good enough. Somewhere I will feel worthwhile and accepted. And then he cuts his hair, he stops using drugs, and he goes on a crusade against his classmates. He's 15, He just ran away from home to use drugs in Florida with hippies. He runs into a little bit of a problem. He runs home, he finds Jesus, goes to church, and starts yelling at all his classmates for, using drugs, and cleans himself up.
By the way, I saw this a lot. I'm sure you did too. Growing up, especially when I moved here to the States, these stories of like, I'd meet someone and they're 16, 17, and they're telling me about how the same kind of stories, I finally figured out my life. I finally, the word finally, every time the word finally was used when you were that young, you haven't finally done what you think you've done. No. But there was always something about how, and it was usually a very dramatic change. Now, a lot of times it was for the good, right? Like they had been very chaotic and now they were actually joining a church group or something. But it always did it always raised a few alarm bells for me, because there was always this sense of, at any moment, another finally could happen. And these finallys are very big dramatic shifts in these people's lives, and I could get caught up in the maelstrom.
Yeah.
In fact, I did a couple times with a few of them. It's tough.
So at the time, there was still animosity towards the Beatles and John Lennon in particular for saying 5 years earlier that John was more popular than Jesus. And
Right.
famously, in the Bible Belt of the United States, there were mass burnings, collective burnings of their records.
Right.
What do you know about this event, Berto?
That, I've seen the interview a billion times probably, where they're sitting there and he's like, I mean, what bigger than the Jesus, but basically, the predictable outcome that happened was that people looked at that as a complete defiance of God. And so the natural reaction was, well, we must burn this to the ground. I remember seeing the videos of people stomping on their Beatles records and looking at the camera and saying, that they no longer worship, or they no longer like them because of it. And then John having to repeatedly, apologetically try to explain that he was just trying to make a comparison. But
Well, in his words, he was saying, I'm just stating the facts that as I travel around, I see that to these young people, we're more important than Jesus to them. And
Yeah,
that's all I was saying,
it's just that it's one of those, like, he both meant, we know John and John's lyrics and everything too well to think he didn't also mean it with a wink. And he should have known better if he really didn't want that. No, but at the same time, he's only like 28 at the time. So what are you going to do?
No, he wasn't 28. I mean, when he said it, he would have been like 25, 24.
Sure, whatever. He's like in his 20s. He's a kid.
Yeah.
So it's like, I said so many stupid things well into my late 30s. So
yeah. And so there was still animosity towards John.
Yeah.
And so he, the murderer, also starts to hate John, but starts to have a complicated relationship with John. Before, he worshipped him. Now that he's a crusading evangelist, he has to hate John as well. So at this time, he also met a girl, teenage girl. He's a teenager as well. And she, in an interview, said he was a very kind and gentle person, which is an interesting data point regarding his personality. A lot of people actually would say that he was kind and gentle. And according to him, he said that she was the only person that he ever loved, which is interesting. And there's parallels between him and Ted Bundy in this instance of an early intense attachment, perhaps on the heels of a lifetime of attachment loss and neglect and terribleness, falling deeply, deeply in love. She breaks up with him. He becomes, very distressed and upset and never loves again, according to him, even though he married later. And she said that he took it really hard. So in summary, we learn that he might have bullied kids, but he also, to some, seemed very nice and very gentle and very kind, very giving. We see an attachment loss that was difficult for him, sign of attachment insecurity. Still probably had black and white thinking, dichotomy between good and evil, Jesus versus John, which is something that's retained from early childhood trauma and neglect. All children have this initial phase of black and whiteness. You're who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. These are boys, these are girls. There's I don't know. I like it, I hate it. Either I love it, or I hate it, I hate it, I hate it.
Yeah.
And to parents, you're either the good parent or you're the bad parent. And
so I have one of my kids is 6, and at that age, and 5 and 6, you have this thing where it's like, I want I want vanilla ice cream. Well, we have pistachio or something. Oh, I never want to have ice cream again in my life.
Yeah.
So it's not just, I don't want the pistachio ice cream, I wanted vanilla, and now I'm disappointed. I now have burnt the possibility for the rest of my life that I will even taste the category of ice cream.
Yeah, right. Because they're undifferentiated. They can't see gray very easily. And to her in that moment, if I were to speculate about her inner process, she was in a process of vanilla ice cream, all good. And then when something got in her way and it was flawed in some perceived way, then it becomes, it switches from all good to being not all good. And the only thing you can do from, degrading from all good, you can't be like 99% good or 90% good. You have to go, it's all bad, including everything that's associated with it. Like all ice creams are bad.
Yeah.
Now,
and nothing I could do could dissuade. Like I had the electrodes hooked up. I was shocking her every time she said she didn't want the pistachio ice cream. She still said she never wanted ice cream again.
Yeah. Well, just keep trying. Raise the intensity of that.
Raise the voltage.
So if you are neglected during that time and you're not given a chance to graduate to the next developmental cognitive phase, you will retain black and white thinking throughout your life. And he seemed to exhibit that. This, I hate society and parents and school, I'm going to run away, to I love society and church, and now I hate John. So we see that possible narcissism elements in the superiority religious-wise over other people. Not, the full-blown disorder, because we don't see other signs. He would annoy, being nice and gentle doesn't really jive with full-blown narcissism, but a narcissistic streak, if you will, ranting and raving against other classmates, like you must change, turn your eyes to God, and it's possibly lends itself to some narcissistic ideas.
I wonder. So I do stuff like that, or at least I have done in my life at a small level. Whenever I would get on a good pattern, like a good kick, like let's say I was at school and I would start really, I had a week where I was like really on top of things. I would tend to get self-righteous about it sometimes. And if I saw like one of my friends was slacking a bit, I'd be like, hey, why are you not, studying harder? Why are you not? And it's kind of, I wonder if there's, at least in some of us, some tendency of when we're doing the things that we want to be doing, all of a sudden we're like actually organized. We all of a sudden start treating others the way we wanted someone to kick our butts when we weren't doing the things, but like we're projecting onto these other poor people.
Right.
I've seen that with myself a lot. I've seen it with one of my friends in college was unbearably like that as well, where he'd get in this like really good kick and then he'd start making me feel like crap because I wasn't doing everything he was doing.
Right.
It's just like...
Yeah. Well, the idea here is that when you are neglected severely young, you have an opportunity to turn to a defense that I am not only, it's this all good, all bad. I'm being treated like I'm all bad, and I think I'm all bad, but that's painful. So an alternative for kids is to develop narcissism, that not only am I not all bad, but I'm all good. I am superior. And in order to uphold this defense, because I need it constantly, I have to constantly assert myself in my mind and externally and inject it into other people's minds that I'm superior. I'm better than everyone, as a way of trying that pendulum swing from John to Jesus, from worthlessness to superiority. Right. And in order to uphold that, I need to constantly be, badgering other people and sending messages of superiority. And now that I've adopted something that I find to be superior, I see others as inferior, and I want to point that out. And I'm not just giving advice, but I'm actually giving an emotional vibe, an emotional message of you are inferior, which makes me superior. We also see possible longing for community and acceptance, but it's conditional, right? Because at first it's with drugs, and then later it's with religion. So he's not really finding true love and acceptance. And also drugs might have affected his brain development. I mean, he, from the age of maybe 12 to 15 and really beyond, because he continued using substances, it's possible that his brain was a little addled. I mean, God knows what he was taking, especially back then. A lot of it was street selling of all sorts of stuff.
I know a person that was doing, what is the laughing gas? The nitrous?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's also amyl nitrate, or what's it called?
It's the stuff at the dentist. I think it's nitrous. Yeah, but whatever. The point is that they would regularly talk about these conversations they were having with these mythical beings, but they would, when I tried to establish the metaphor of it, they would correct me constantly. No. I'm not making some sort of metaphor here. This is real. Like, this happened. And they were 100% convinced of it. So, some sort of psychosis about it. Like, they really had these conversations. So, yeah, I wouldn't be that shocked that a teenager having all sorts of weird substances in their body starts developing all sorts of weird things.
Yeah. And the causation can go either or both ways, that if you are prone to psychosis and magical thinking, you might be more prone to drug use to cope or for various reasons, or you might have a risk of developing psychosis and your drug abuse actually exacerbates it, or both. So it's hard. We don't know. Even if we had him to study at the age of 12, we wouldn't know. So let's take a break, Berto. When we get back, let's continue with this deep dive. It's funny because I thought this episode would be an hour and a half. It looks like it's going to be extremely long, like our other Beatles episodes tend to be.
Inevitable.
Hey, deserving listeners, as you all know, I am constantly recommending that people go to therapy. We all need therapy from time to time. Well, one of the options available that is definitely worth checking out is BetterHelp. If you're looking for a therapist, I would give it a try by going to betterhelp.com/Kirk. Make sure you use the promo code Kirk because you get 10% off your first month, and it really helps us out. As you watch these videos, I know many of you have been motivated to find your own therapist, which is great because you deserve it. And I know also that it can be hard to find a good fit, find the right one for you. Well, one of the options available in terms of your shopping is to go to betterhelp.com/Kirk. I've been told you can start communicating with your therapist in under 24 hours. You can message your counselor at any time. Plus, you can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. I've also been told that it's often less expensive than in-person therapy, and you should know that this service is available to clients worldwide. So go to betterhelp.com/Kirk to get 10% off your first month today.
All right, we're back from the break. So later teen years, and early adulthood we'll cover. So this is when he enters his third community, which is YMCA. He becomes a counselor or a leader, one of the workers at a YMCA camp for kids. And all the reports are saying, including from some of the kids who were interviewed later, that he was adored by the kids, that they loved him. Lots of reports from kids and adults saying that he was really great. He was gentle and passive and kind and caring. And again, he's being recognized. He's being loved. He's getting awards. They're cheering him. And maybe it's because the kids are less complicated, easier to, one, get their approval, but not only approval, but also adoration, like absolute worship from these kids.
The little people.
Yeah, little people.
Yeah.
And his boss is interviewed soon after the murder of John Lennon, and he said he was so good with children, but also with coworkers, he would tend to have grand ideas. His coworkers, the other adults, would say that he would sometimes rant a little bit, seemed a little opinionated, had grand ideas. So we're hearing this narcissism possibly, but also his ongoing suffering and his, I don't know, when you watch the documentary and you hear about this phase of his life, because at this phase, from the outside, it's just like, well, he's just a regular guy.
Yeah.
But you start to hear this anger. What was your take on it, Berto?
But see, it's weird. I could relate a bit from some angles. I am someone that in many occasions, I bet you if you ask some of my coworkers, to describe things about me, one of the things that could come out would be that I have grandiose ideas and that I sometimes can rant about things, right? And so I can kind of relate from that angle. I also know that when I was younger, in my 20s, I was very, very, very angry inside, and I didn't realize it. And so there's a lot of things there that don't necessarily translate into doing something disastrous or really destructive, but are probably way more common than we know and think.
Yeah.
With people that are otherwise, again, my coworkers would describe me as a nice person, as someone that, and I'm not saying I'm not, but at the same time, I have some of these other things. I can go on rants. I can have grandiose ideas that are very impractical quite often. And
Yeah.
so
and
it's hard to say at that moment, oh, you see, that's the guy that would have murdered someone.
Right. And I hope that that's clear, we should make that clear that everything I'm summarizing or speculating about is true for millions of people around the planet, the vast, vast majority of which never hurt anyone. So there's nothing about this story that we're saying this far as just like, oh, see, that's when it started. No. As usual in these situations, there's really no way to predict who's going to do this. There's no clear indication that he was until he started planning it. But let me ask you, Berto, what were you angry about? What was underlying the anger, do you think?
Well, what I came to find out is I was still very, very angry at my mother for, when I was 3, she left my dad and I and moved and started a new life.
So you're in your 20s and
Right.
you're really angry.
But I didn't know that. I didn't actually consciously know that.
Right. So if I would have asked you when you were in your 20s, what are you angry about? What would you have said?
Well, first of all, I would have said, I'm not angry. What are you talking about?
Well, if you had
I
answered,
literally would have said that.
like if you had dug a little bit below the surface.
Well, because what you would probably said is like, well, I was with you last night at the club, and your behavior seemed extremely hostile and angry. And I would have said, well, sure, I was drunk and I was having a bad day. It's like, what? But if we dug under the surface, it would have probably been, I think I might have talked about my dad. I think maybe like, well, I'm upset because, I'm having to support my dad, and, that's frustrating.
Were you upset at the world at all?
I was upset at some aspects. Like when I first started going to therapy, my therapist pointed this out to me quite hilariously a few times, because I would get there late every single time, as you can probably imagine. And I'd get there late in a huff, and I'd walk in and I'm like, oh, hi, sorry. She's like, what's wrong? Oh, the stupid traffic. I can't believe, how can we even deal with this? How can people survive like this? Why do they choose to spend like hours in a car? And then, my therapist is like, okay, can I ask you, let's take a breath. Let's take a breath. Let's slow down a little bit. I want to ask you about how you're feeling right now. And I'm like, no, like I said, no, I mean, like I get about the traffic, but what are you feeling in your body? And I was so annoyed. I'm like, I have no idea why we're talking about this. I'm just annoyed at the stupid traffic. So I was annoyed about that. I would also purposely listen to right-wing radio, which at the time was people like Rush Limbaugh and Michael Abrash, all these people. And I would just get into a frothing frenzy about how angry I was about these people too.
Interesting. So
I think
if you hadn't had therapy or good relationships, as you had enough of in your 20s, can you imagine, and you developed depression and perhaps suicidality, can you imagine a world in which you start to contemplate suicide and maybe taking people who are bad drivers down with you or something? Yeah,
never suicide, but definitely destruction. I mean, I could have seen that. I could have seen that I would want to become some sort of enforcer for something. Like, okay, well, I'm going to go punish this thing. I don't know what is the sequence that would have driven me that far, but it is conceivable. The reason I say not suicide is because of probably my narcissism being such that I'd be like, well, no, I'm too important for the universe to lose, but I'm certainly going to go and deal with this threat. And I am actually not sure that it would have been that unrealistic, because if a series of things had happened in a different way, maybe additional tragedies, things that I didn't have to look forward to.
You lose your job, you have no job prospects.
And I lose my community.
You lose your relationships.
Then maybe I'd be, I would probably, when I was younger, I told my dad one time, because my dad is a very leftist thinking, he really looked up to the revolutionaries in South America and the leftist guerrillas and things. But I told him one time, I'm like, well, I mean, why don't you join them then? And I didn't mean that dismissively. I meant, instead of sitting here railing all day long at the television and about how much you hate every politician, why don't you go in the jungle and join forces with them and do something with the rest of your life? I wouldn't do it, but it sounds like you're so passionate. Why don't you go do that? And so I probably would have followed my own advice, right? I would have been like, okay, I'm going to go really do something. And then that might have ended up in violence in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I don't know if we've ever had that angle of your analysis.
Yeah. Especially if I was abusing substances. Like if I was doing more alcohol, which already made the rage would bubble up a lot of times. Yeah. It was weird. You met me after this phase of my life, but I used to there were Dr. Berto and Mr. Heidelberto, where sometimes I would get drunk and I was the guy the Berto, and then other times I get drunk and it was, some of our friends would later point out to me, you were not, that was not fun. You were very aggressive and blah, blah. And I would become very damaging to myself and others. And so there was I was on a bad path if that had continued.
Right. So I think the conceptual, in the DSM, we have all these labels: depression, psychosis, personality disorders, psychopathic, sadist, this kind of thing. But we don't have a word for what you just described. And I feel like we need one, because I think that for a lot of the mass shooters, a lot of the, indiscriminate killers that kill people that they're not really involved with, or people that aren't, there are people who kill someone hey, I'm going to take their money, or they're going to tell someone about what I did. There's instrumental murder, and then there's non-instrumental murder. And that's what John Lennon, him killing John Lennon had nothing to do with his life. It didn't, John Lennon never got in his way. And a lot of the mass shooters are like this as well. Even people, people that go through schools, it's you're just killing to kill. And I think that a lot of them, if not literally all of them, because if you look at if you think a lot of the cases off the top of your head, they all had that element. They were suffering greatly. They had contemplated suicide, and they manifested their suffering through anger at the world, anger at so-and-so, to the point where the logical end of the road of that anger and that externalization of the suffering is murder. And I'm going to remove them. They deserve to be punished, or something along those lines. Right. And we see the beginnings of that in this individual who assassinated John Lennon. Yeah. And I think that it's important for us to understand that, because I think it really does laser, and I've talked about this before, that another element to this, it's not always present, but often is, as it was the case with this individual, is suicidal thoughts, wanting to die. Because if you match those two things up, you're suicidal, you're seriously suicidal. You're not just mildly, you're like, I'm definitely going to do it, and we'll get into it later. He actually was seriously suicidal and tried to kill himself a couple times. Yeah. and you match that up with anger at the world, then you're like, well, before I go, I might as well get revenge. I might as well.
It's an extra, like, what do I have to lose kind of thing.
Right. What do I have to lose? I'm just going to die, kill myself anyway. I mean, I'm not going to go to prison. Might as well get some satisfaction before I die. And a lot of these killers, the killer in California that is so famous, the killer in Las Vegas, seemingly, hard to know about that one. The killer in Connecticut, New Haven, a lot of just suffering and anger and desperation. And I think that's what we start to see here is even though he had a community with the hippies, but that was disillusioning. And then he found community with the Christians. And I don't know what happened there, but he left that. Then he has this community with YMCA, but he's still suffering. He's still isolating. His coworkers would say that he was a loner and depressive. And he would often get angry and rant about, hypocrites. Yeah. When someone wronged him in his eyes, he considered them to be dead. There would be these, just like, that person's dead to me. They wronged me. And as you were saying for yourself, it in all likelihood is unresolved anger towards his parents. It's transferred, it's displaced.
I mean, I grew up watching my dad night after night while the news was playing, just constant rage against the machine. And, that person's an idiot. That person is stupid. That person's corrupt. And it was always like in my mind, I was thinking, he's not wrong. Like, I was already, I don't know, old enough to understand that pretty much maybe 80% of the things he was saying were probably right. But he was wasting his life's energy just doing that, just yelling at a TV, And I thought, wow, that's so helpless. That is so... And of course, at the time, I had no concept of, he must be doing this because it's just the feeling I had was always like, this seems so fruitless.
And then fast forward 15 years and you're listening to Rush Limbaugh.
And I'm doing it, right? And that was one of the things I realized in the therapy. And we talked about that quite explicitly. I remember that moment of realization. I'm like, oh my gosh, I am yelling at the TV screen. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
There's a suffering and from that suffering comes anger because naturally, right? It's like, I'm suffering unfairly. Why is this happening? It's frustration, right? Yeah. And you need the anger to go somewhere and it can't go towards your parents because you don't even know that's where it's supposed to go. And two, your parents aren't going to receive it well, and you need to preserve at least some connection with them because you desire that so much. So it's like, well, Rush Limbaugh is an easy target. Politicians are wonderful targets. One thing that I've come to conceptualize is that when I'm guessing a good percentage of those people who are extremely politically active, particularly against a party or an individual, they're transferring their parents onto that person. Now, maybe it's for the good, maybe it's good that some of that stuff's happening, but I'm pretty sure that that's true. Not to say that activism is always some kind of psychological thing, but the intensity, the motivation, the obsession, the rumination, the 24/7 nature of it.
Yeah, you're 100% here. So I recently, and I mean this last week, so that recent, I subscribe to many channels on YouTube. A few of them are political in nature. There's a contrast between two of them. One of them is the David Pakman show that I listen to regularly, and I really like. And this guy is very even keel. He presents things. He points out illogical things, hypocrisy, all these things. But he's never yelling at the camera. He's just always even keel. And I love that. It's soothing. It's like a Mr. Rogers for political discourse. On the other hand, and I was a longtime fan of the Young Turks, which is a different network. And the main guy, Cenk Uygur, he is someone that I really admire and really look up to. I thought he's done a lot of great things.
Yeah, you've been talking about him on the podcast.
Since we've had the podcast.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I finally, sadly had to unsubscribe because, in a way, he's my father. He was doing this now constantly, and it's not just him, it's a couple others, and they just look at the camera and they're just railing and railing and railing and yelling and yelling. And lately it's about how stupid and incompetent and corrupt the Democrats are. And it's just like, and I couldn't take it anymore. I'm like, all right, this is not helping me at all. And so I finally had to unsubscribe. But I like these other channels they still present the same data, same information, same news. They're just not yelling at the camera fruitlessly the whole time.
Yeah, well, sometimes you just gotta grow up and move away from the Rush Limbaughs to the Mr. Rogers of the world.
Absolutely. And look, there is a time for rage, or I should say, for directed intensity. I think the movie Don't Look Up presents a case for some of those occasions. I believe it. You cannot kick off a revolution when it's needed if really all you say is like, hey, come on, let's go try our best. I get it. It's just the nonstop nature of that just, you can never maintain that psychologically, in my opinion. And so that's the thing with these individuals, with myself, with others that struggle with this, is if you're always at 11 on these anger things and you can just, what is the outlet? If you don't go to therapy, if you don't somehow get help, what is the outlet?
Right. And for some, it's just continued rage and toxicity and drug abuse and pushing people away. And for a very small minority, it's murder. And I'm going to kill John Lennon, and that will solve my problems. I'll get back at the man by killing John Lennon. So in summary, what we can say about his transition in adulthood is he still has black and white thinking, still has narcissistic ideas. The kids start worshiping him. He really likes that. He probably engineered his behavior to get kid worship, which is part of the job description, but maybe he was really into that. And the other thing we learn is that he's pretty functioning, right? He has a job. He has coworkers. He's doing good. He's like the star employee, and his,
doesn't fit the psychopathy profile from those parts.
Exactly. Then he enrolls in seminary. So this is his fourth attempt
right.
to find happiness, to become a missionary. And it didn't go well. His narcissism was being challenged because in seminary, his opinions and his grandiose attitude about himself did not go over well in seminary. And so at this point, according to him being interviewed, he says, I felt like a nobody once he dropped out of seminary. I felt like a nobody. And this is that narcissistic black and white. I'm either a nobody or I'm superior. But underneath it all, I felt like a nobody. What does a nobody do? A nobody gets a nobody job. So he quit and became a security person.
Wow.
Which, by the way, I used to be a security guard for many years.
Yeah.
I had a security job from the age of 16 to 23 or something. So I guess I was a nobody then as well. And he says, I had too much time to think and I became depressed, he said. So, he's just sitting in a building in a security box and he's just thinking, and this is before, cell phones or internet or anything. So he's just staring at the wall, and he said he became depressed. I'm guessing that my conceptualization is that he was always depressed, but he didn't really notice because he was constantly distracting himself through these other things, YMCA, druggies, and religion, this kind of thing. And now he doesn't have anything. And so he became really depressed. And at this point, he starts to think about killing himself. So in summary, what we have is he's starting to give up. We can start to hear that in his life and in his story, in his narrative. He's demoralized, he's isolated. In other words, demoralated. And this is the breeding ground for suicidal thoughts. Okay. So as an adult, he is 1977, age 22. He decides he's going to kill himself officially, and he flies to Hawaii to kill himself. He goes there, he spends all his money, he drinks a lot, and he actually attempted to kill himself twice. One of the attempts he talks about, he got in a car, drove up to north side of Oahu, and was going to asphyxiate himself on the exhaust of the car. And drove to the beach, got out a hose, fed it into the car, turned his car on, was sitting in the car. And then a fisherman came up to the car and knocked on the window. But prior to that, he's like, okay, it's over. And he's, closes his eyes. And someone knocks on the window, and he opens his eyes through all the exhaust, and he thought he saw an angel rapping on the door, telling him to live.
Oh.
At some point, he becomes hospitalized at least once in Hawaii for his suicidality. And he recovered, and which is, I guess good for him, bad for John. Yeah. And he got a lot of attention. He was a star patient. We're seeing another pattern here of him thriving / maybe really trying to please everyone. And they gave him a job. So he went from being a patient to being an employee of the psychiatric hospital, and he became some sort of psychiatric assistant.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
When does that happen? That's weird.
Yeah. So at this point, he feels really good, and he decides he wants to travel the world, and he goes to a travel agent in Hawaii. And since there's a lot of fellow Asian brothers and sisters out there, like myself, he meets the travel agent is Japanese-American woman, Gloria Abe, which, by the way, it's a little bit of a joke, and I'm sure you have these versions of Colombians, but Japanese-Americans, every Japanese-American has an Aunt Gloria. An auntie.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Gloria is this really common.
What? I wouldn't have thought that, because that's like a Spanish name.
Yeah, but somehow there's a lot of Glorias, a lot of Glows.
That's interesting.
Yeah. There's a lot of Harrys, and a lot of I think a lot of Georges. Anyway, so he marries her.
We have a lot of Chads. Chad Gutierrez, Chad Rodriguez. Just kidding.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? That Chad is very Spanish sounding.
He got her to convert from Buddhism to Christianity, so we see him being very pressuring of her, perhaps, hard to know. They had a lot of conflict, which shouldn't surprise us too much, but is, according to the two of them, they had a pretty bad marriage, and he starts to slide back into depression. So he goes into the hospital, things go well, he decides to travel the world, and he did a bit. He marries Gloria, everything's going great, but then relationship starts going badly, and then he slides back into depression, self-hatred, and rage. He is still obsessive and angry about being a nobody, started drinking heavily. One day he's wandering Honolulu, drunk and despondent, and he wanders into the library, and he says that my identity was almost nil. I was in the library to find out who I was. So this is a telling thing that, he's in his early 20s at this point, 23-ish, and he is despondent, and he's like, who am I? And this is something that you'll hear from people that are emotionally neglected, abused when they're growing up, is they're not given a chance to explore. Who am I? What do I feel? What do I want? What's my identity? What's my sense of self? And they just drift from community to community, oh, maybe I'm a druggie. Oh, I'm not that. Okay, maybe I'm a Christian, maybe I'm a YMCA, maybe I'm that, and he tries to adopt a self by living a life that other people are living, but he never feels fully into it because he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what he wants because he was neglected or abused during those critical years when you can develop.
Did he find out he was number 24601?
Yeah. And so he is in the library trying to find out who am I? Maybe if I find that, I won't want to kill myself. And he finds this book on John Lennon, since, his old obsession and ongoing obsession. He flips through the book and he finds a picture of John on the roof of the Dakota, the fancy building in New York. And he became angry. Also, I think he saw a book of John on a yacht or something.
Like these celebrities.
Right. Yeah. John is a phony. Just like the phonies that Holden Caulfield railed against in Catcher in the Rye, which we'll get into in a second. And he's angry that John had it all, and yet this individual, the murderer, had nothing. John seemed to have it all, And by the way, marrying a Asian woman, a Japanese, a woman of Japanese descent, as Yoko was Japanese. Now, this idea of a phony, Berto, do you know the cultural notion of a phony from the 60s and 70s?
I know that in Family Guy, there's that guy that's always like, he's a phony. He's a great big phony.
Oh, really? Is that based on that?
No, I don't know. It's just a recurring gag that they do. Maybe it is. Maybe it is, because, he has a lot of things inspired by those gilded eras. I don't. Like, I do know sort of culturally how being authentic is important in most, in most cultural, in most groups. But I don't know. Tell me what's the significance of phony?
It was emerging from, you could say, the 50s sort of counterculture, beat culture, just anti-conformity. And emerging through the 60s and 70s, it was this response to the 50s. The 50s were, and the 40s were depicted by conformity and, try to fit in, keeping up with the Joneses.
Right.
And the 60s and 70s were pendulum swing, if you will, away from that. And there was this huge movement of anti-phony and pro-authenticity. And it was actually pretty affected within the therapeutic community, with the humanistic movement is arguably completely based on, at least in essence, the idea of not being a phony. In fact, Fritz Perls, who is a very famous humanistic Gestalt experiential therapist and theorist, he, in fact, years ago, you watched the three therapists that worked with Gloria, actually was her name. You had,
I remember that, yes.
Yeah, you had Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and...
Didn't Fritz Perls write that book, Pearls of Wisdom?
No.
He should have. And
he was famous for confronting people about their phony self. He had this theory, and it's well in line with humanistic theory of like, stop being a phony, be real, be authentic. His idea was a lot of suffering and problems exist in relationships and in life and in your own mental health when you're always trying to conform, you're always trying to be what other people want you to be.
Right.
Be you. And of course, this is totally in line with the 60s and 70s. And Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye maybe influenced a little bit, or was a part of that emerging movement. And for the individual who murdered John Lennon, he was really obsessed with this in 1977. He and had been for a while, of just this idea of anyway, so then you could say the 80s were a response to the 60s and 70s, because there was a lot of conformity in the 80s.
Yeah.
A lot of conservatism.
And then in the 90s, it bled into, but for us, it was like being a poser was bad, which is kind of like being a phony.
Exactly. So in the 90s, it was a reaction to the 80s about anti-establishment and dressing like a grunge person who doesn't care about fashion. And then the aughts, and arguably into today, it's more conformity.
Glam.
I feel like, at least my take, and of course I don't have a finger on the pulse of young society, but I feel like since the 90s, we still live in a very conformist era, an era of you must be of the mainstream. And the mainstream morphs over time, anyway, point is that he was very much in this idea of phony, and he identified John Lennon because of this book. He just looks at this book and sees John in this fancy building with a fancy boat, and says he's a phony because he stood for truth, he stood for justice, he stood for peace, he stood for the everyman, and there he is, a rich guy. He's a phony.
Right.
So he starts to have homicidal rage at this point. And he talks about how he wanted to kill John. He started really thinking about killing John Lennon at this point. So again, remember, you got drug abuse, you've got ongoing narcissistic ideas of I'm special. The world has a special place for me. My mom always told me that it was the only bastion away from complete worthlessness and depression and suicidality and wanting to die and this obsession with John, and John has it all. And if I could only be him, I want to be him, but he's a phony because phonies are bad. And,
right.
and he's
Plus
trying to
the
get
Jesus thing.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And he's listening to, according to him, the Beatles late at night, and he's stripping naked and he's lighting candles and he's turning to Satan at this point.
Yeah.
He's actually asking Satan, please give me the power to kill John Lennon.
It's a little ironic if he was upset about the Jesus thing.
Right, but again, the black and white, right? And the looking for anything to give him meaning, looking for anything to reduce his suffering. And my guess is that it was a distraction, that it distracted him from suicidality, it distracted from his inner pain, this idea of if I just kill him, then maybe everything will be fine. But there was a part of him that was like, but no, I don't want to kill John Lennon. That's not okay. And he was really trying to put it out of his mind. At this point, he reports that the little people returned, and now they're not his minions. They are rich and powerful, more powerful than him.
Oh.
And they were now board of directors. They're the man, right? Yeah. And so he presents his plan to kill John Lennon to the board of directors, the little people. But they reject him, and he becomes very furious to this. So this lends itself to schizophrenia or psychosis, schizoaffective, because this is pretty classic psychosis, the persecutory nature of it, right? Mm-hmm. That your fantasy life, you wouldn't have a daydream or a fantasy about presenting your plan to a board of directors and have them reject you and have you get angry at them. Why would you create that, right?
Right.
Unless, I suppose maybe, but it's definitely in line with a really common psychotic theme of persecution from the.
I might do that as an intro to a more erotic fantasy in my head, but not as a regular thing.
Wait, how would that go?
Just like I'm presenting to the board of little people in my head, not literally little people, just like Lilliputians. And they all are very upset at my proposal. So they gang up on me. They tie me down like Gulliver. And they start poking at me with all sorts of things in all sorts of places. And it only goes south from there.
Literally. He said, I wanted to get back at all the people who hurt me. I wanted to get back at all the people who hurt me.
Eesh.
This is the mantra of people who do this sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like we don't focus, but it's always, he was autistic or he had gambling problems. No, it's it's suffering and deep, deep pain and isolation that manifests eventually into, I'm going to get revenge. And so he had a very typical mindset to someone that does. He becomes obsessed. Right. And there were reports of him fantasizing, maybe from him or other people, that he would get a nuclear device and kill millions of people. So he's really starting to go over this idea of saying, I want revenge. I want to kill people. I want them to know that they've hurt me. I want them to understand what they did to me. And now, of course, likely it is transferring from his childhood. But he's in his 20s. He hasn't been to therapy. He doesn't know. I don't know if he went through actual therapy when he was hospitalized. I don't know. Drifted from job.
Even if he did, as we know, this is not something where you're like, well, I went to the doctor, right. And so now I'm fine.
Exactly.
It is a process.
Yeah. And at some point, he stopped seeing a psychiatrist, according to him or Gloria. I can't remember which. And so that implies that he was on meds, perhaps. Hard to know.
Got off the meds.
Yeah. So maybe off the meds. He drifted from job to job. So in summary, we have a common reaction to severe demoralization, anger at the world.
Yeah.
You can point that anger inward, which often results in suicidal thoughts or in self-hatred, or outward, which is hostility towards others. We could imagine that maybe his slight tendency to have psychosis was being exacerbated by the stress he was under, and the little people were starting to emerge again. Some people kind of are on that line between psychosis and non-psychosis, and stress will exacerbate it, and when they're not stressed, it'll be manageable or go away. And killing John became something to focus on. It's easier to focus on this plan than to contemplate, who am I? Why am I a nobody? What am I going to do with my life? It's easier to say, well, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get back at the world by killing at least one of the phonies. Everyone will see that he's a phony or something. So let's talk about Catcher in the Rye. What do you know about this book, Berto?
So I had to read it in high school. It was assigned reading for some reason in 10th grade, maybe?
Yeah, it's a very oft assigned book in high school.
Yeah, I don't know if they still assign it. I know that some places they don't
do.
like it. They do?
And it's very, by the way, throughout time, particularly in the 60s and 70s, it's one of the most, if not the most censored books in American high schools and libraries.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I had heard that, which is...
So prior to him killing and identifying Catcher in the Rye as a factor, it was the most censored book in high schools and libraries in the United States, 60s and 70s, and still to this day is very banned. By the way, in the Wikipedia page, in the banning section, it says in 1987, and I'm reading this and I'm like, huh? In 1987, it was briefly banned at Issaquah High School, where I was in high school, and I was in Issaquah High School at 1987.
And they briefly banned it while you were there.
But I'm just wondering, why is it in the Wikipedia post? And it says
That's so weird.
3 board members of the school board in Issaquah alleged the book was part of a communist plot.
Oh.
Which is like, huh? The offended, and as I read that, I'm like, oh, that kind of sucks. But then, Berto, the offended board members were immediately recalled and removed in a special election.
Whoa. Issaquah acted.
Yeah. Because they banned Catcher in the Rye. So, and I'm just like, huh? Like, so, because I'm sure around the country and around the world, there were stories of the book being banned and something happening, but why is this, my high school included?
Yeah, that's so weird.
Yeah.
Well, did you rail against this? Do you remember railing against it? Like, why are you banning my book?
I mean, I would have. I was very much anti-censorship at the time, so...
So at the time, I didn't know any of this controversy. I found the book to be okay. So, to me, it felt like a more boring version of The Graduate, which is a movie I loved. I had seen it when I was young in Colombia, and I didn't quite understand it. Then I saw it again in high school, and I really loved it. Then I saw it again when I was older, and I really, really loved it. But I don't know, for some reason, this book, I didn't identify with the main character. And it's hard for me if I'm reading something and I don't, at least, I can't connect with the main character. The main character rubbed me off as a little bit of a spoiled individual, or spoiled in his attitude and stuff like that. It could have something to do with the fact that I had moved from Colombia to up here, and I had reintegrated with my mother, and there was structure, and a lot of the structure was what you could call phony structure. But I needed that structure, and I appreciated it. So I remember being especially annoyed by how everything adult to this individual was fake and phony, because I'm like, well, I don't know, it feels kind of nice sometimes. So right. I actually didn't feel him in that sense, you know.
Yeah, I mean, the book, I haven't read it, but I know enough about it, that written by J.D. Salinger, Holden Caulfield is the protagonist or the speaker, and it's told from his point of view. He's depressed. He's, pretty sad and alone. He had a bad relationship with his parents, and all this coincides, by the way, with the murder of John Lennon. He's searching for meaning. He's longing for attachment, but always screwing it up with his desperation and reactivity. He alienates people because of this. He and the only person he can communicate with is his 10-year-old sister, who is, a younger person who is more innocent and less reactive, similar to the guy who murdered John Lennon, can only relate to kids. Holden Caulfield's angry at the world. He drinks too much. He feels superior. He rails against phonies. Has a fantasy. The title, The Catcher in the Rye, is this fantasy that Holden Caulfield has about saving children before they go off a cliff in a rye field. And so he's the catcher of the kids before they go over the cliff, because in a field of rye, you can't see the edge. And the idea is that Holden Caulfield feels superior and feels like he's trying to save children from becoming adults, essentially. He's trying to save them from losing their innocence and becoming a phony like everyone else. And to me, this sounds like an early, kind of like an incel or MGTOW or Gamergate kind of person. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, no, completely. So that was, okay, obviously I didn't know any of these things at the time. I knew people like this character in high school. I can think of at least 3 people that I knew that reminded me of this type of character, which then nowadays in our current times would have been in those categories, probably. One of them in particular nearly killed me in a car accident when I was 18. So maybe that's part of the things I had.
Because he was reckless and suicidal, you think?
I believe, yeah.
He was trying to kill himself, and you just happened to be in the car.
Yeah. That's a very plausible explanation to what happened to us.
Because he was deeply suffering and angry at the world?
Probably.
Wow.
Now, so I don't know if it's that I had a spidey sense or whatever, but for whatever reason, the book actually rubbed me the wrong way. Now, as I grew older, there are some aspects of it, like I don't remember it very well, but I reread the synopsis and stuff. There are some aspects about it that I could relate to. There is, for example, some aspects there about how he gets a prostitute, and he doesn't actually want to have sex with her. He just wants to talk. He wants companionship, and I could relate to that because I remember feeling that so much when I was younger that I just it wasn't necessarily that I wanted like the sexuality aspect. I wanted a mother, but I didn't know that that's what I wanted. I just wanted that female companionship. And so I was like, okay. And then there's other aspects that, of course, as I matured and I grew older, I was like, okay, I can see. But at the time, again, probably influenced by the fact that I had just gone from very little structure and kind of a very chaotic environment full of totally not phonies, but that were destroying the country. I moved to something that's way more phony, but safer and felt a lot better. And so I was like, no, what you're talking about is the chaos I don't want to be involved with. And I was probably one of the phonies he would have railed against.
Yeah. For me, I definitely had a streak of this. I think if I had read it when I was a teen, there would have been parts of it that I definitely would have related to. The judgmental attitude towards the system. I really had a pretty good dose of that. I wasn't angry at the world. I didn't want to kill anyone, but I was very skeptical of culture and the system and why we were doing certain things. Like, I remember I was a senior and I'm in some sort of history class, and we're given this assignment by the teacher, which is it's a map of the United States, and we're supposed to color in the states. That's the assignment.
Yeah.
We're 17, 18 years old, and that's the intellectual stimulation. And I remember thinking it was just a symbol of school is complete bullshit. And this whole thing, like, why am I here? I could be doing so many other things right now, and this is just complete crap. And everyone, I'm looking around the class and just be like, oh my God, we are sheep. And the teacher is a sheep. Everyone's just following these rules, these ideas that were passed down to us. We're supposed to do all this stuff, and it's for nothing. It all is, I didn't say phony, but it's all fake, it's all not real. It doesn't matter. It's meaningless. Life is meaningless anyway. And so why are we doing this? We should be...
It's like complete downward spiral of nihilism.
Yeah. I mean, I was very nihilistic, and I still have a streak of that. And there were times when I thought, we should all just be running around burning things to the ground. Like Fight Club I saw when I was in my 20s.
Yeah.
It very much resonated with an attitude, and I think stereotypically in a kind of humiliating way, with a lot of men who are privileged. I think there's a mindset, an incel Fight Club, Tyler Durden worship mindset that I think is common among a certain Chad, if you will.
Well, listen. So Fight Club is one of my favorite movies. It was one of my favorite books. Not as favorite of a book as it was a movie. However, I had very little agreement with most of its philosophy and most of its, and so everything I enjoyed about it was probably not what Chuck Palahniuk wanted me to enjoy about it. Who knows? I've actually watched a lot of interviews with him, and he seems like a perfectly reasonable dude. But honestly, I actually couldn't relate to the non-conformity with the system, and let's just all burn it all down. None of that made any sense to me, or could I relate? But it didn't matter because the movie was so enjoyable, and it did ask interesting questions and all that. For whatever reason, I have always been a lot more of a rule follower in at least in the main ways. I break trivial rules, and I have a sense of entitlement when it comes to, you and I have talked about this, my time is more important, that narcissistic thing, my time is more important than this. But when it comes to big rules, I believe, no, we need a functioning society. And part of that might have been, I could see this. I grew up in a very dysfunctional society where people were not following what the man wanted. They were just doing whatever the F they wanted. And if that meant screwing over their neighbors, that was okay. And I didn't like that. That was chaotic. It was destructive. It was ugly. So then I moved up here, and the illusion at the time was, finally a society where people are sheeple and follow the rules, and we all walk in a line, and we don't cross over the line, and we don't run each other over with our cars, and I liked that. So a lot of these let's burn the system down things didn't really resonate with me, because I'm like, no, I've seen what that is.
Interesting. Yeah, which is why I said a privileged Chad would believe this, because they don't really understand what anarchy and chaos actually means. What they're railing against is they feel the pressure of life, and they don't like it, and so they're taking this extreme point of view of burn the whole thing down, instead of just maybe dial back the materialism a little bit.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like in the movie with Fight Club, when Edward Norton's character, I think he's on the toilet looking at an IKEA catalog, and he's visualizing, okay, this couch and rug will go well with this coffee table,
and they have the little price for everything. Yeah. It's just so great.
That was scene. I would have been mid-20s at the time, and that was exactly what I was emerging into. Everyone has that phase when they get to a certain age where they don't need to buy they don't need hand-me-downs of furniture, and they don't need to go to a second-hand store and just get any old table. They can actually...
Now I'm going to get the thing I want.
Actually, we can graduate to IKEA, which is cheap, but at least it's new and it looks okay. And I was exactly in that zone, and I remember when I saw that scene, I'm like, it touched a part of me that wasn't really being honored, that I wasn't honoring, and no one else was either, of what am I doing? Because you kind of at 25, you see your life path before you of just materialism and conformity and stupidity, and whitening your teeth and dyeing your hair and making sure that you always look perfect, and making sure that your house looks good for guests, and making sure that you have the right shoes, and that it was like the in Brazil, his mom, just that whole mindset. You just want to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to give in. I don't want it. And
I know. I mean, I understand. I really do. And then yet for me, it was always, yes, I want the structure. I want the Christmas holidays to be a certain way. I don't want the house to go all dilapidated. I want people to still show up to the party at the right time with the right hors d'oeuvres.
Right. Yeah, but you're not talking about the other things, really. You're just talking about like, well, if we let go of conformity or a little bit of it, maybe we'll go back, we'll slide back into chaos and violence.
Yeah, it's basically, obviously, even then, and certainly now, there's a billion things that I think we've overdone, and now we're in trouble. We've overspent, we've overburned, we've overchopped, all that stuff. Absolutely. Could we use a hell of a lot less consumerism? Yes, absolutely. At the same time, yeah, I look at Mad Max and I don't say, oh yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
That's the world I want to live in.
Or Narcos, for example.
Or Narcos, yeah.
And which arguably was materialistic because they're just trying to get money and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think in this discussion, and regardless of gender, but I think particularly for disillusioned men, the way we're socialized to externalize and to judge others, there's a relatability, I think, to the individual who assassinated John Lennon and to Holden Caulfield that I think keeps Catcher in the Rye relevant even today. There's still people reading it, and I think this is why they assign it, and I think this is why it's so beloved by regular people and murderers. There's an anger and a rebellion against conformity and a disillusionment with what society is offering to you. If you slot into this slot, then this is your life, and you don't have to think, and you don't have to be. You just consume and work this job and have your kids in the white picket fence and say how do you do and tip your hat and have the right car, and this is your life. But he already felt alone and already felt demoralized and worthless and didn't know who he was, and I think that society was offering him, here's a path, and he was like, but I've already tried various paths. Yeah. I've tried religion, I've tried the hippies, I've tried YMCA, and I've tried marriage, like nothing has worked for me, and I'm still upset, and this is, where the incels and this kind of thing comes in. It's like, it must be feminists. Yeah. It must be the frogs and the hormones. It must be, it's anger. It's like, there's something wrong and I'm suffering and I need someone to attack because something's wrong here. But what's happening is they are suffering from reverberations of when they were 3, and they're like, something is wrong. I'm being treated in a way, or I'm seeing things that makes me feel like something's wrong, but I don't know what it is because I'm 3, but something is wrong here. And that gets retained into adulthood, and you just focus it at John Lennon instead of your parents.
Yeah. I mean, so I mentioned The Graduate, obviously Taxi Driver. There were these stories that became pretty popular after this book. I don't know how much, obviously there must have been some influence, some level of influence, but it's very similar patterns. The Graduate's more like the white collar angst, and the Taxi Driver's more the blue collar angst, but it's there, right? It's the single white dude, and it doesn't have to be white, but a lot of Americans are white, so and they are
half.
Yeah, and they're depressed, and they're frustrated, and they're they don't know what to do with that frustration.
Right, and I would argue that a good percentage, if not the vast majority, the anger is childhood related, and they have no way of healing from that. And God bless you for being able to go to therapy and actually have someone that could really draw your attention to that. And
I mean, it was lucky too, because if it hadn't been for my friend that told me, because he was going to the same therapist and recommended her.
Who was that friend? Can you say who that was?
I'd rather not, since I just mentioned they were going. But it is someone you know, and basically it was not just, hey, I've done therapy, you might want to try to. It was more like, dude, I recommend this one, and it was recommended to me by 2 of my friends, and I was like, oh, really? Well, okay. And that was what really got me over the hump. That and The Sopranos, right? Those were the 2 things that got me to go to therapy.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
So Berto, we're recording this ending later, but this is going to end part 1, and then we're going to continue with part 2, because as we were recording this, I'm like, this episode's too long. I have to break it into 2 parts. So we're going back and recording the ending to part 1. Does that make sense to you, Berto?
Do you have the time stone with you or something? Like, are you doing a little Doctor Strange here?
Exactly. So that does it for part 1 of this episode. Tune in next time when we do part 2.
Which is about to be what we talk about, but you don't know that because you're only listening to the ending of part 1.
Well, we're in the middle of talking about the second part. But anyway.
Oh, God. We got to go
deeper.
deeper.
Out there, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.